Okay, so we'll bring the piece in here, and first look, we automatically know it's most likely aluminum, of course. Things like magnesium or any other kind of alloy metals or whatever. They all kind of weigh differently and whatnot, but there's a couple of telltale signs of what this is primarily made out of. And the fact that it is cast, the most commercially cast metals out there are actually aluminum. And how we tell it's cast is you bring it in closer here and you'll see these casting impressions and whatnot. Now these are all for the company who did the casting. They usually say stuff like manufacture date, time, their logo, their product, whatever the case is. If it's a part of a production run, product line, whatever the case. So now the shop that I am building this for, or I'm modifying this for, has already left their markings on it to tell me exactly where and what needs to happen here. So in this case, this tab down here needs to move up top here to clear the chain. And the reason why is because you can kind of see that the chain made some contact here, and that's another piece that we're going to have to take care of when we're actually cutting and welding all this off here. So looking up close here, we've got a radius type of edge here that actually goes inward a little bit, so we'll have to think about the access of the welder if we can actually get it in there. And then we also have a fillet edge down here at the bottom, or a radius fillet edge, depending on which one term you want to use, but it's rounded instead of being completely squared. Now that's also an area where it's going to get a lot thicker, and that might hinder our ability to weld it. So let's start by getting this cut off. We'll make a couple of lines here to figure out our lowest point of cutoff, and then we'll get to setting it all up and getting it welded. So since we have that fillet edge on the inside there, I'm going to need something to mark it out so I don't go slicing right through that. I actually want to keep that edge on there. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take a straight edge, I'm going to place it up on the inside, and at the point where it stops and just begins to touch that fillet edge, or the top of that fillet radius, make sure that my square sits just right here. I'm going to make a mark. Do the same thing over here. So this initial line right here that we're creating is going to be our cut line. That's our visual reference in which to slice all this out of here. Now in addition to that, I'm going to take it off right about here. And that'll be the areas that we're going to cut out. This whole section right here is not intended to be put back on, because the whole point of this is to move this piece over here up to the bottom, or actually which is the top. Since this is upside down, it's supposed to be moved over here. So everything down below will create our clearance mods. So let's get this cut real quick. So I typically cut aluminum like this when I'm doing modifications. I usually feed it into the bandsaw, but since this is kind of an awkward angle and I won't be able to see my lines or anything like that, and I don't want to risk cutting anything else on this, not really looking to make any more work for myself here, but I'm going to use the cutoff wheel on the end of the grinder here. We'll start by taking this slice out of the top of it. Now I'm going to very delicately, and I mean delicately, go back and take off just a little bit of this aluminum on here. And we're going to get it prepped up for welding. So when I say very delicately, I mean let the flat disc do the work and not your muscles. And the reason why is if you take too much off of there, you're going to have this humongous gap that you need to fill in, or it's just not going to sit right. One section of the tab is going to be too low, too high, whatever the case is. So let's start by taking this down nice and slow. I put a brand new flat disc on my grinder here, so that way it doesn't contaminate it with anything else. You can obviously see there it doesn't take a whole lot of work to do that. So now I'm going to put down a tapered edge at the point where I want this to mount. So what we have to do here is I don't want to taper this entire edge. I really only want the just enough to where we had it before. Just enough to get this to weld in here. So I'm going to make a big bright red mark, and I'm not going to taper it any further than that section right there. Just getting some of this oil and debris and contaminants and whatnot off of this piece. Some some good old-fashioned acetone, but let's take a real close look here. You notice the color of the area that was scratched off of there. Look really carefully and notice that that's not shiny, silvery, bright, reflective material. That is in fact copper. And part of the chroming and nickel plating process would be adding a layer of copper to it, which means this whole piece, instead of just being polished aluminum or anything like that, is actually chrome plated. So we need to make sure that every area that we intend to weld, including this inside section and the piece that we're welding onto, needs to be completely stripped of its chrome. So we're just going to do that by very, very delicately, once again, going over with our flat disc on the end of our grinder. Now if you take too much out of it, you're going to end up having to put a lot more metal back on it, which is really not what you want to do. You want to just take off enough to get a good penetrating weld. Now the same thing is going to apply to the tab that we have to weld back on. It is also chrome plated, and we have a couple of things that we need to address and take care of on it. But I'm going to first start by just squaring off this edge and making it nice and even, and also getting the chrome off of it. So you can see it doesn't actually take a whole lot of effort to achieve that. With a very light use of the flap disc on the grinder, it'll come right off. So we also need to fix this section right here. Now it's really difficult to work with a small piece like this, so we're going to attack that as soon as we get it reattached to the rest of the cover. So we're going to set this aside real quick, and now we'll set up for our offset. So in order to get this welded on nice, flat, and even, right where it needs to be, you probably guessed that we need a nice, flat, and even surface. But the only problem is my table has seen some use over the years, so it's not perfectly flat and even anymore. So I'm going to use this piece of wood here that I have laying in the corner of the garage here, and we'll use that as our nice, flat, and even surface. But as you probably guessed and most likely already knew, wood is a terrible conductor of electricity. So I'm going to add this piece of aluminum. Make sure it's nice and clean, dust it off, and we'll take our cover, stick it right here on the edge. So this will also allow me a place to clamp everything down and make sure that it doesn't move, which is very, very important because it can't move while we have it everything going to be welded on here. So if it moves, it's going to be a little difficult to manage. I'm going to clamp this right to the edge of the table here, so that way I have a really solid ground throughout, and then I don't start conducting electricity myself. Now, we need to have an 1/8 inch worth of space and clearance, so I'm going to use just an 1/8 inch piece of steel I have laying around here. And we're going to hold this up right where it needs to go. If you notice right off the get-go, we're almost perfect. We just have to trim it down a little bit, add a bit of a taper, and weld it in there. Now we do have a slight gap, and that little gap is okay as long as it's not a humongous one. But that little gap right inside of there, when we take this weld down and make it nice and flush and even, this gap will actually hold a lot more metal and help hold everything together. So we're going to take this down, take the chrome off, and add just a little bit of a taper to it so that we get that nice, clean, flush, even weld. Now let's hold it up in place, see how close we are. That's actually a pretty decent fit right there. Just about the exact point where it needs to sit. So let me take a clamp in here and just kind of get it in here for a rough look and make sure that everything is pretty much where we want it. Everything will be all right where it's at. So we'll clamp that down and we'll come in here and have a look. All right, pretty close. So let's get this edge lined up here and we'll start buzzing the welder. Now, cast aluminum can be some very, very finicky stuff. If you ever try to weld it, you'll notice that a whole lot of impurities and junk kind of come up to the top of the weld, and you got to sit there and try to flush and purge them out of there so you get the best weld possible. So we're just going to slowly work on this and get it all filled in. Nice and cool now. I made sure that everything's solidified and actually landed right where it needed to, so we're good to go on welding the inside of it now. Now, one thing I was referring to when it comes to the impurities of everything, you see that kind of nasty, ashy looking junk and whatnot, and there's a little bit of little black dots and whatnot that float up to the surface on it, and those are part of the imperfections of it, and it's kind of doesn't make for a nice pretty weld, but at the same time, as long as your weld is true, that's really all that matters. So we'll go back and brush up a couple of these, get down in the corners, and then we'll get to the refinishing portion of it. See, with that nice edge there, that nice corner, we can actually slowly work it in there by hand, and it won't take too long to do. Of course, the finished work will come out just absolutely fantastic. It'll look like it was meant to be this way. So once again, let's let it cool down completely, and then we can start finishing on it. Now again, very delicately, using the flap disc, we're just going to slowly take away the metal around it and strip the chrome off. Now, we don't want to deform this too much to a point where it's just going to look kind of silly sitting on there, but we do want to clean it and make sure it gets itself ready and prepped up. So it's a little more workable, a little cooled down now. We're going to use the flap disc again for the initial trimming and fitting of this. Now again, once again, I can never stress this enough. Let the flap disc do all the work, not your muscles. Very, very delicate touches here. All we're doing is getting the bulk of this down so that we can go over with the progressively finer grits and everything else that will make this refinish nicely. So very, very delicately, very, very lightly, go over it with the flap disc and let it do all of the work for you. Concentrate everything on the welds themselves, not the metals around it. Alright, so one of my favorite pieces right here is a flap disc. It's made out of those surface prep pads, like the little roll-lock ones that you see used on air grinders and whatnot. Well, this is a very, very fine, very, very light prep disc or a flap disc. So it's only going to take off small layers at once, but again, the same rule applies. Let the flap disc do all the work, not your muscles. So what we're going to do is take this, outfit it to our grinder, and we're going to strip off some of this chrome here all the way around it, and we're also going to get rid of all of these abrasive marks on here. I'm going to blend this in nice and smooth and very evenly. Almost like it was never there. Now, there are some little tiny porous parts and portions of it that are, unfortunately, they're really difficult to get out of there. You just got to keep going over and chasing it out with the welder itself and letting it blend until there are no more holes. So I'm going to have to go over and chase all of those out real quick, but this is pretty much finished from where it was before. We took all of the chrome off of here, so that way there isn't any of the copper showing or anything like that on there. Now there's just a little tiny bit on the edge here, but that's one of those things that we just can't do anything about, unfortunately, unless it goes out for re-chroming. So let's take a brush here, a little Scotch-Brite pad, and I'm going to restore the brushed finish on this real quick. And this is just to find out exactly how much work needs to be done here. Now if it comes out nicely in the brush finish, then we don't have to break out the buffer and chase all of this down real quick. So that's what I'm going to find out before I start chasing all those little porous holes out of there. So it's looking right now like this might actually do the trick. That there are no heavy grinding marks or anything like that that need to be taken out even further. So right now it's looking like we're going to do pretty good on this one. That looks just about right. We'll get it a little more cleaned up. We'll kind of add to the brush here a little bit. Looks like it blends quite nicely. So I'm going to go back over and chase these out nice and finely with the welder. It's going to take a little bit of work, but most of these big holes will disappear. Sometimes there's going to be some really tiny porous holes in there that you'll never be able to do anything about unless you fill it in and whatnot, but we're going to try and get as many of them out as possible. All right. Let's get that final finish on there. make sure it matches the rest of it. And it's just like it was never modified to begin with. Almost looks like it came from the factory this way. And we also have that nice little 1/8" offset right there on the bottom, which will allow them to fit their bracket inside of there. So I'm just going to give this a quick cleaning, and while I do that, I'm going to go over and review here with you. When it comes down to the abrasives, a flat disc will get you very, very far, but sometimes it'll take too much off. So again, remember, let the flat disc do the work, not your muscles. When it comes to the very, very fine abrasives, remember they only take off very, very small amounts, and they won't gouge out the metal significantly to the point where you're going to have to spend hours refinishing it. So in this case, we landed with the brushed finish and not a polished one, but if it was a polished one, we'd be able to easily polish these edges out and bring it right back to its original shine. And that would be very difficult to do or very time consuming if you don't use the very fine abrasive and let that do all of the work for you. So I'm going to go drop this off back to the client, make sure everything is good to go and I get the green light on it. But in the meantime, thanks very much for watching this episode of the Fabricator series. We'll see you guys in the next episode.